Imagine this, a candlelit courtroom in the heart of medieval Rome. Cardinals and bishops gather, robes rustling, faces tense. At the center of it all, a throne. And on that throne sits a corpse. Yes, a corpse, rotted, dressed in full papal regalia, on trial. This isn't a Monty Python sketch. This actually happened. And today, we peel back the layers of one of the most macabre and bizarre episodes in papal history, the Cadaver Synod. The year is 897 AD. The heart of Europe beats unevenly. Kingdoms clash, empires fracture, and the holy city of Rome, once the jewel of imperial might, now lies in the grip of spiritual rot and political decay. The papacy, once regarded as the moral compass of Christendom, has become a battlefield, not of swords but of egos, alliances, and betrayal. This isn't the Renaissance. This isn't the Reformation. This is the Saeculum Obscurum, the dark age of the papacy, a time when popes didn't just rise and fall. They were hunted, poisoned, deposed, and in some cases, exhumed. In this chaotic tapestry of sin and sanctity steps Pope Stephen VI, a man whose papal reign lasted only a year, but left a mark that would shock history for over 1,000 more. For it was under Stephen that the Cadaver Synod, one of the most grotesque events in religious history, was conceived. The stage? A courtroom bathed in flickering candlelight. The cast? Cardinals, bishops, and a pope gripped by paranoia and vengeance. And the defendant? A decaying corpse, pulled from its resting place, dressed in full papal regalia and propped on a throne to face a surreal trial. But before the corpse could stand accused, before Stephen would scream at the dead, before Rome would witness this macabre theater, something had already been set in motion. A centuries-old struggle, an unforgiving thirst for revenge, a church divided not just by dogma, but by dynasties. You see, the papacy in the late 9th century wasn't just a spiritual office, it was a political throne. To sit on it meant control over kings, armies, and wealth. It meant influence that could tip the scales of war and succession. And that power attracted not saints, but players. Power-hungry nobles, scheming bishops, and families who viewed the Vatican as just another crown to seize. Among these factions stood the Spoletans, a formidable noble house whose grip on central Italy was as firm as it was feared. They brokered marriages, staged coups, and bent the will of Rome to suit their ambitions. They were kingmakers and pope breakers. And at the center of their contempt stood a man named Formosus, a former pope whose deeds, both political and spiritual, had enraged the Spoletan dynasty. Though Formosus lay dead and buried, his actions during his lifetime still threatened the legitimacy of their power. They didn't just want to erase him, they wanted to annihilate his memory. And that's where Stephen VI comes in, a pope hand-picked, propped up by Spoletan interests, and desperate to prove his loyalty. What better way to secure that allegiance than to humiliate his predecessor in the most unforgettable way? But was this truly about justice? Or was it madness born from fear and manipulation? The deeper we dig into this tale, the clearer it becomes. The Cadaver Synod wasn't just a trial, it was a warning. A grotesque message carved into the annals of history. A message that not even the grave could save you if you had made the wrong enemies in life. Before he was exhumed, condemned, and mutilated, Formosus was flesh, blood, and ambition. Born around the year 816 in the Eternal City itself, Formosus came of age in a world where faith and power danced a dangerous waltz. He was a gifted man, eloquent, shrewd, and diplomatically precise. The kind of churchman whose sermons calmed mobs and whose letters moved kings. By the 860s, he had risen to become the Bishop of Portus, a prestigious title near the bustling Roman port of Ostia. But even then, whispers followed him. Not of scandal, but of drive. He wasn't content with guiding flocks. He wanted to shape history. Formosus was dispatched on delicate missions across Europe. His most famous, an embassy to the Bulgarians. So admired was he, they begged the Pope to make him their archbishop, a rare honor. But Rome refused. suspicious of how much the young bishop was adored abroad. That was the first time Formosus made enemies in high places. Suspicion grew. Accusations of ambition, of overstepping, of aspiring to the papacy before his time. He was excommunicated under Pope John VIII, a bitter rival. Branded as a usurper, a threat. But exile didn't end him. He waited quietly, and after John's assassination, was reinstated. His supporters never wavered, and in 891, their loyalty was rewarded. Formosus was elected pope. At last, the throne of St. Peter was his. But the crown came heavy. The political landscape was crumbling. The Holy Roman Empire was in flux. Rome teetered between loyalty to different factions, the Carolingians in the west and the rising Spoletans in Italy. Formosus, ever the strategist, threw his weight behind the Carolingians, inviting Arnulf of Carinthia to march on Rome and seize power. It was bold. It was brilliant. It was dangerous. The Spoletans viewed it as betrayal, and worse, personal insult. But Formosus had bigger concerns. He was trying to restore the papacy's independence, to lift it out of the claws of noble families who treated popes like pawns. He ordained bishops, issued reforms, and tried to stabilize the Vatican's position in the empire. And then, he died. Naturally? Perhaps. Or perhaps not. In those days, few popes retired. Most were buried. On April 4th, 896, Pope Formosus breathed his last. His body was laid to rest in St. Peter's Basilica. But peace would elude him. He left behind unfinished business, contested ordinations, enemies in high places, and a power structure that felt threatened by his every move. And so, his story didn't end with his burial. In truth, it was only beginning. For those who hated him, death was not enough. His legacy had to be undone, erased. And under the watchful eye of the Spoletans, a new pope rose, Stephen VI. And with him, a chilling idea. What if you could still be tried after death? What if sins followed you into the grave? Formosus was about to face a reckoning unlike anything the Church had ever seen. To understand the Cadaver Synod, the desecration of Formosus, and the madness of Stephen VI, we must understand the true power behind the curtain, the House of Spoleto. In the late 9th century, Italy wasn't a single kingdom. It was a mosaic of duchies, territories, and rival warlords clawing for influence. One of the most formidable among them was the Duchy of Spoleto, ruled by a family that understood the greatest wars weren't always won on battlefields, but in backrooms, through alliances sealed by blood, gold, and God. The Spoletans were warriors, yes, but they were also tacticians. Their leader, Duke Guy of Spoleto, had ambitions far beyond regional dominance. He didn't just want a duchy, he wanted an empire. In 891, through a clever mix of bribery, military pressure, and church manipulation, Guy was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by none other than Pope Formosus. But this was no alliance of trust. It was one of necessity. Formosus, caught between crumbling empires and rival claimants, had made a deal with the devil. And like all devil's bargains, it came at a cost. The relationship quickly soured. Guy's heavy-handed rule, his desire to control church appointments, and his interference in Rome's affairs infuriated Formosus. Tensions escalated until the Pope made a fateful decision. He would call upon Guy's rival, Arnulf of Carinthia, a Frankish king, to invade Italy and depose the Spoletans. Arnulf accepted. In 894 and again in 896, he marched on Italy, capturing key cities. He was crowned emperor in Rome, but soon fell ill and was forced to retreat. The Spoletans, humiliated but not destroyed, plotted revenge. Then, Formosus died. But the hatred did not. The Spoleto dynasty, now led by Duke Lambert, Guy's son, had unfinished business. And it wasn't enough to outmaneuver the Pope politically. They wanted revenge of a more enduring kind. Enter Pope Stephen VI, a loyalist to the Spoletan cause. Stephen was elevated to the papacy not because of piety, but because of politics. He was a placeholder, a vessel for vengeance. The Spoletans knew exactly what they wanted from him: the complete humiliation of Formosus and the total dismantling of his legacy. But this wasn't just about payback. The legitimacy of Lambert's claim to the imperial throne was under question because Formosus had supported Arnulf. If Formosus's papacy could be declared illegitimate, then all of his ordinations, declarations, and alliances, including Arnulf's imperial coronation, could be annulled. The strategy was brutal but brilliant. Discredit the man, and you erase his power. Undermine the office, and you take back the throne. And so, the Spoleto dynasty, cloaked in noble titles but driven by raw ambition, pulled the strings. They pushed Stephen to commit the unthinkable, not just a heresy, not just an injustice, but an abomination, a trial for a corpse. It was politics at its most grotesque, a dynasty rewriting history by desecrating the dead. What followed would leave an indelible stain on the papacy and serve as a chilling reminder of how power, when mixed with vengeance, respects neither the living nor the dead. If the Spoleto dynasty was the architect of vengeance, then Pope Stephen VI was its chisel. His name rarely appears on lists of famous popes. He left no theological treatises, no saintly reforms. But Stephen VI carved his place into history through something far more unforgettable: madness made manifest in holy robes. Little is known about Stephen's early life. Born in Rome, likely into a family of minor nobility, he rose through the ranks of the church under the shadow of power, not by preaching piety, but by aligning himself with the right patrons. First as Bishop of Anagni, then elevated to higher stations, he proved himself loyal, obedient, and politically malleable. In a time when loyalty mattered more than virtue, this was his most valuable trait. In 896, after the sudden death of Pope Boniface VI, a papacy that lasted only 15 days, Stephen was elected pope. But this wasn't the will of the people. It was a coronation dictated by the Spoletan faction, who saw in Stephen a perfect instrument, a man pliable enough to follow orders, desperate enough to hold on to power, and fearful enough to obey even the darkest demands. Rome, at this time, was seething. The city had become a chessboard of blood feuds, papal rivalries, and shifting allegiances. Every pope came with a patron, and every papal election was a move in a larger, deadlier game. For Stephen, the rules were clear from day one: dismantle Formosus, destroy everything he built, discredit his every act, and do so in a way that could not be undone. At first, Stephen followed tradition. He replaced bishops loyal to Formosus. He issued decrees aligning with Spoletan interests, but it wasn't enough. Not for his masters, not for his own fears. The anxiety of Rome crept into him. He saw enemies in every corner, ghosts in every shadow, and perhaps he began to believe that Formosus, even in death, was a threat that had to be silenced permanently. That's when the whispers became a plan. Whether the idea was truly his own or placed in his ear by Spoletan agents, we may never know. But by the winter of 896, Stephen was convinced, or coerced, into an act so grotesque that it would shake the very foundation of papal authority. He would dig up his predecessor. He would dress him in holy robes. He would place the decayed body on a throne. And he would put that corpse on trial. To Stephen, perhaps it seemed like divine justice. To the Spoleto family, it was political genius. To history, it became the most infamous ecclesiastical proceeding ever recorded. The man who once sat quietly behind bishops would now scream at a skeleton. What drove him to that moment? Was it madness, fear, or simply obedience to forces far stronger than himself? One thing is certain. When Stephen VI walked into the Lateran Basilica that day, he wasn't just a pope delivering judgment. He was a puppet of revenge, dragging the church into a nightmare it would spend centuries trying to forget. It is January 897. Winter grips Rome with a cruel stillness. The Tiber runs cold and dark, winding past crumbling ruins and silent cloisters. But within the towering walls of the Basilica of St. John Lateran, something is stirring. A drama. is unfolding that will make even the boldest scribes hesitate to put pen to parchment. The people of Rome gather outside. Whispers travel faster than candlelight. Something unholy is happening within the sacred chamber. Inside, the basilica is cloaked in heavy incense, the air thick with dread and disbelief. In the center of the church, where bishops are usually consecrated, a papal throne has been placed, elaborate, high-backed, bathed in candlelight. But the figure seated on it is no pontiff of the living. It is a corpse, rotted, gray, bound together with silk and wire to keep it upright, draped in full papal vestments, its eyes, long since decayed, covered with cloth. This is Pope Formosus, dead for 9 months, dug from his tomb, brought to trial. The audience is a blend of clergy, nobles, and horrified onlookers. Even the Yuan church hierarchy doesn't quite know what to make of it. Some avert their eyes, others stare, frozen between disbelief and nausea. The smell alone is nearly unbearable. At the altar stands Pope Stephen VI, his eyes wild, his voice sharp and accusatory. Dressed in ceremonial robes, he is not the image of pious serenity. He is a man possessed by rage, by fear, or by something darker. A deacon, trembling, has been assigned to act as legal counsel for the corpse. He is instructed to speak on behalf of Formosus, to answer Stephen's charges. But what defense can one offer for the dead? Stephen begins his tirade. The charges are declared: usurping the papacy, violating canon law, and ascending to the throne of St. Peter while still holding a bishopric. All charges that could have been debated while Formosus was alive, but now twisted into accusations, meant to erase him from history. The Pope paces. He shouts. He gestures violently at the corpse. At times, he addresses Formosus directly, as though expecting an answer from the dead. At others, he lashes out at the bishops present, daring them to speak in defense of the man they once followed. Some records claim Stephen's voice cracked with rage. Others suggest he descended into a frenzy, screaming at the bones, accusing them of betraying God and Rome alike. But the corpse remains silent. No movement, no rebuttal. Just a decaying figure slumped in sacred robes, transformed into a symbol of how low the papacy had fallen. This wasn't justice. This was theater. A grotesque display of domination, not just over a man, but over memory, over history itself. Outside, the people began to murmur. Inside, the ritual continued. And yet, in this perverse courtroom, there would still be a verdict, a sentence, a punishment. Because to Pope Stephen VI and those who controlled him, death had never been a barrier, only a beginning. The Cadaver Synod wasn't just a spectacle. It was a ceremony of humiliation, one designed to erase dignity, desecrate memory, and render Formosus not merely guilty, but ridiculous. The trial continued. Page after page of charges were read, aloud, some rooted in canon law, others little more than political grievances dressed in holy language. The absurdity of it all only deepened with each line. These weren't just accusations against a man. They were accusations against a corpse. Formosus, dead and voiceless, was charged with coveting the papacy, with presiding over sacraments while unworthy, with violating the sacred laws of office. Pope Stephen VI declared that Formosus had never truly been pope, that his very election had been illegitimate. Therefore, every action he took as pope was null. Every bishop he ordained, invalid. Every decree he signed, worthless. To enforce this twisted logic, the mock trial required a stand-in, a deacon, young and visibly shaken, forced to act as Formosus's proxy. This terrified man was ordered to answer the Pope's booming accusations with practiced lines. He did so because he was compelled, or he confesses his unworthiness. Words Stephen could twist into a confession, one literally spoken by the dead. It was theater of the grotesque. According to chroniclers, Stephen's performance was both theatrical and terrifying. He reportedly screamed across the basilica, his hands flailing, spit flying from his lips as he berated a pile of rotting flesh. He circled the corpse, occasionally pointing, cursing, condemning. Some say he foamed at the mouth. Others claimed he wept while delivering judgment, as if tormented by some unseen force. Guilt, perhaps, or madness. The court, filled with clergymen, struggled to maintain composure. Some sat in horrified silence. Others glanced downward, avoiding the spectacle. But no one dared interrupt the Pope. No one challenged the ritual. Power, fear, and political allegiance stitched their mouths shut. The few surviving accounts of the trial transcript, fragmented and secondhand, describe a courtroom that had become a theater of shadows, with Stephen acting out a performance that seemed less like a legal proceeding and more like an exorcism. He wasn't merely condemning Formosus's actions. He was casting out the ghost of his influence. And to drive the mockery further, Formosus's papal vestments were left intact, at first. A twisted honor, meant not to dignify, but to ridicule. A dead pope dressed as though he still reigned, as though he were present of his own will, facing charges with dignity. But dignity was the first thing Stephen intended to destroy. Eventually, Formosus's robes would be ripped from his corpse, his fingers of benediction hacked off with brutal finality. The very hand that had once offered blessings was now accused of spreading corruption. This wasn't a trial, it was a ritualistic undoing. A symbolic reversal of papal authority. Stephen wasn't just rewriting law, he was rewriting memory. And as the candles flickered against the stone walls of the basilica, the dead pope sat still, while the living pope descended ever deeper into madness. After days of macabre theater, of accusations hurled at a corpse and forced responses spoken by a frightened deacon, the inevitable moment arrived. The verdict. There was no jury, no appeal, no grace. Pope Stephen VI stood tall beneath the vaulted arches of St. John Lateran, his voice a chilling blend of righteousness and rage. He looked upon the rotting remains of Formosus as though they still breathed defiance. The charges, sacrilege, ambition, violation of canon law, had been theatrically proven, if not legally. The sentence was to be severe, not in law but in legacy. The court, if one could even call it that, declared Formosus guilty on all counts. His papacy, Stephen announced, was hereby nullified. All acts performed by Formosus were invalidated. Every bishop he had ordained, every law he had signed, every sacrament he had delivered. The church would feel the ripples of this verdict for generations. But Stephen was not content with symbolic victory. What followed was not simply punishment. It was desecration, ritualistic, brutal, and final. First, Formosus's corpse was stripped of the sacred vestments, the alb, the stole, the pallium, all torn away by trembling hands under Stephen's watchful gaze. The fingers of consecration, those of the right hand used to bless the faithful, were cut off one by one, a grotesque act of theological mutilation. Stephen, they say, watched in silence as the bones cracked and snapped. The papal garments removed, the body now resembled not a pope, but a discarded marionette. All dignity gone, no longer a spiritual leader, no longer a man, just meat, condemned by history. But still, it wasn't enough. Stephen ordered that Formosus's remains be dragged from the basilica and thrown into a common grave, not a saint's tomb, not even a pauper's plot. Just dirt, cold, unmarked earth. But even that would be denied. Days later, the body was unearthed again, this time not by papal order, but by a mob. Dragged through the streets, it was hurled into the murky waters of the Tiber River, as though Rome itself wished to forget what had happened. The river, though, had no such intention. Legend says the corpse washed ashore weeks later, tangled in reeds and debris, discovered by a group of monks who, horrified and moved by pity, quietly reburied it in secret. But no secret could bury what Stephen had done. Rome was horrified. Even those who hated Formosus began to question the sanity of the living pope. Whispers grew into anger. Bishops began to fear for the validity of their own ordinations. If a dead pope could be tried, who was safe? And Stephen, once the punisher, began to feel the chill of judgment himself. The Cadaver Synod had not ended with a verdict. It had merely crossed a threshold, from absurdity into outrage, from politics into madness. And the city that had watched a dead man condemned now turned its eyes toward the man who had condemned him. Rome had seen blood before: assassinations, riots, imperial coups. But what Pope Stephen VI did in January of 897 was different. It wasn't just barbaric, it was blasphemous. It touched something sacred, and in doing so, it stirred something ancient and volatile in the Roman soul. Word of the Cadaver Synod spread like wildfire through palaces, markets, monasteries, and with every telling the story became more grotesque, more surreal. The image of a dead pope, dressed in holy robes, propped on a throne, having his fingers hacked off and his body flung into the river, burned itself into the minds of the faithful. Disgust quickly gave way to unrest. Clergy whispered behind closed doors. Bishops who had once bowed to Stephen now feared for their own legitimacy. After all, if Formosus's ordinations were nullified, so too were theirs. Every sacrament they'd performed, every marriage, baptism, ordination, might be spiritually void. Outside the churches, the people muttered. Rome's citizens, already jaded by corruption and violence, had finally reached a breaking point. This wasn't politics anymore. This was desecration. And even in a city ruled by power, some things were still sacred. Anger became movement. Movement became rebellion. It began in murmurs outside basilicas, then in protests outside the Lateran. Within months of the trial, the same voices that had cheered Stephen's rise were now calling for his removal. Some wanted justice, others retribution, but all agreed on one thing: the man who put a corpse on trial no longer deserved the throne of St. Peter. The turning point came in the summer of 897. A mob, driven by fury and righteous indignation, stormed the papal palace. The doors were battered down, guards scattered. No blood was shed that day, but history was made. Pope Stephen VI was dragged from his quarters and thrown into prison, stripped not just of his title, but of his robes, his honor, and his last shreds of authority. What happened next is veiled in silence and shadow. Some say Stephen raged in his cell, screaming the name of Formosus. Others claim he had gone mad long before, tormented by guilt and visions of the corpse he had defiled. But one thing is certain: within a matter of weeks, Stephen was dead, strangled in his cell, murdered, likely. By whom? No one knows for sure. Perhaps agents of his enemies, perhaps even his former allies, eager to erase their own complicity. And just like that, the man who dared put a corpse on trial became one himself, buried without ceremony. His name a curse whispered through generations of scandal, but the story doesn't end there. In the wake of Stephen's fall, the church began a frantic effort to repair the damage. Formosus's body was recovered from the Tiber by devout monks. He was reburied with honor. Later popes would officially nullify the Cadaver Synod, calling it an unspeakable horror. But the damage had already been done. The world had seen what happened when power forgets mercy and when madness wears the mitre. The Cadaver Synod was over. The pope who orchestrated it was dead. But the tremors it unleashed within the church were far from settled. What Stephen VI had done wasn't just unprecedented, it was theologically catastrophic. The Catholic Church, the spiritual anchor of Western Europe, was suddenly drowning in questions it couldn't answer. Could the dead be tried? Could sacraments delivered by a disgraced pope remain valid? Were ordinations, baptisms, and marriages now spiritually void if Formosus had touched them? And most disturbing of all, if a pope could be judged after death, who then had the authority to judge him? Bishops panicked. A wave of uncertainty swept across Christendom. Dozens of clerics ordained by Formosus questioned whether they had ever truly received the Holy Spirit through apostolic succession. If their authority was invalid, then so was every sacrament they'd performed. A spiritual house of cards. Rome itself became a theological battlefield. The next pope, Romanus, tried to stabilize the church by reversing Stephen's decisions, reinstating Formosus's decrees, and recognizing his ordinations. But Romanus's reign was short-lived. he was deposed within months. His successor, Pope Theodore II, took a bolder step, declaring the Cadaver Synod null and void, and having Formosus reburied in the Basilica of St. Peter with full honors. For a brief moment it seemed the storm had passed, but then came Pope Sergius III. Years later, in 904, Sergius reasserted Stephen's verdict, once again denouncing Formosus and declaring his papacy illegitimate. The Church lurched backward. The theological seesaw swung again. History was no longer a record of the past. It had become a tool of power. And through it all, the faithful watched with confusion and grief. The one institution meant to reflect the eternal had shown itself as terrifyingly temporal. Corruption was not new, but corpse trials, mutilations, posthumous excommunications, these were spiritual earthquakes. Theologians debated, but few dared write openly. The Church's authority was supposed to rest on the unbroken line of St. Peter, but if that line could be questioned retroactively, where did it end? The Cadaver Synod had exposed the greatest vulnerability of the papacy, not heresy, not paganism, but politics. For centuries, enemies of the Church would point back to that moment. The Reformation's thinkers, centuries later, would cite the Synod as proof that the Church had been corrupted long before Luther ever picked up his pen. The Cadaver Synod became a wound that never fully healed, and within Rome, it left a scar that twisted both faith and fear. From that moment on, a quiet understanding settled within the Vatican. Certain things, no matter how scandalous, were better left buried. And yet, history remembers. For while relics may fade and tombs may crack, the image of a corpse, seated on a throne judged by the living, remains etched into the conscience of the Church, not as a moment of glory, but as a warning. Centuries have passed since a corpse was put on trial in the heart of Christendom, but the echo of that bizarre spectacle, the Cadaver Synod, has never fully faded. Today, historians sift through the dust of forgotten scrolls, piecing together what may have truly happened, and why. To modern scholars, the trial of Pope Formosus is less about madness and more about something far older: fear. Fear of losing power, fear of an uncertain future. Fear that the Church, riddled with factions, rival dynasties, and imperial interference, was slipping beyond the grasp of those who claim to lead it. Dr. Peter Stanford, a leading church historian, puts it simply: the Cadaver Synod was an exorcism of political guilt, dressed in liturgical costume. They weren't judging a pope. They were judging their own reflection. Others suggest Stephen VI was a man under pressure, both psychologically and politically. His erratic behavior, they argue, was not insanity, but the byproduct of a system so corrupt and dangerous that any man placed within it could crumble. In that sense, Stephen becomes less a villain and more a tragic figure, swallowed by a machine too vast to defy. Dr. Mary Valdez, a theologian at Oxford, reflects, this wasn't just about Formosus, it was about rewriting the very idea of papal legacy. They were trying to control not just the future of the Church, but its past. Historians point to how the event was quickly buried by the Church itself, its records suppressed, its memory silenced. For hundreds of years, the Cadaver Synod was almost whispered history, too shameful to recount, too strange to believe. Yet it remains one of the most potent examples of how even the holiest institutions can become instruments of vengeance when power is unchecked. In recent decades, scholars have returned to the event, not with ridicule, but with deep questions. How could faith survive such brutality? What does it mean when justice is performed not for truth, but for theater? And perhaps most hauntingly, who holds the Church accountable when the Church is the one holding court? Modern filmmakers, authors, and academics alike have rediscovered the Cadaver Synod as a grim parable, a warning about the fragility of truth in the hands of the powerful. Because at its core, this is not just the story of one pope and one corpse. It is the story of every institution that forgets its purpose, of every ruler who fears legacy more than judgment, of every time humanity chooses spectacle over substance. And perhaps it is a reminder that even the dead, if defiled unjustly, will rise again, if not in body, then in memory. For in history, no truth stays buried forever. In the great corridors of history, there are events that shine like beacons of progress, and others that fester like wounds. The Cadaver Synod is one of the latter, a moment so bizarre, so unsettling, that it reads more like dark fiction than fact. And yet, it happened. A pope tried a corpse. A church turned its altar into a courtroom. And Rome, ancient, eternal, fractured, watched in stunned silence. It would be easy to dismiss this tale as just medieval madness, a freakish footnote in the annals of the Vatican. But history doesn't survive because of what's comfortable. It survives because of what it forces us to confront. The Cadaver Synod wasn't just a symptom of corruption, it was a mirror held up to power itself. A reminder that even the most sacred institutions are vulnerable when fear eclipses faith, when ambition outshouts reason, when symbols are used as weapons and legacies as scapegoats. What Stephen VI tried to erase with rope and ritual, history, preserved with ink and memory. Formosus is not remembered for his trial. He is remembered because of it. In death, he exposed a truth that Rome, indeed the world, has grappled with ever since. That morality is not guaranteed by office, and that justice, to mean anything at all, must serve something greater than vengeance. Today, we walk through churches built atop centuries of such stories. We kneel beneath icons. We light candles for the departed. But somewhere, far beneath the stones and incense, still echo the footsteps of that strange procession. The moment when the dead were made to stand trial for the sins of the living. So ask yourself, what would drive a man to put a corpse on trial? Was it madness? Or was it something far more human? Fear of legacy, fear of judgment, fear that history might not forget what you've done. But history always remembers, and when it does, it doesn't knock, it exhumes. Thank you for watching. If stories like this fascinate you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us next time as we uncover another forgotten corner of history.